evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that hopefully help improve your life. I'm Stu Reed. Here's my co-host, Dave Bernstein. Hey, Dave.
Hello.
Today we have a very special guest, Miss Cara Alamo, who's with us. She is a PhD communication professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University, where she created the university's programs in social media. She's been writing for CNN Opinion about the impact of social media and issues affecting women since 2016, and is the author of a recently just published, I believe this month, book. There it is, Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back. Cara, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to join you.
Yeah, and parenthetically, I forgot to mention that Cara is also a graduate of City University of New York
A
with the
proud
Doctor of
one.
Philosophy and Masters in Philosophy and Arts from City University. Okay, welcome.
Thank you.
So your book just came out. I'm just kind of looking over some of the our reaction to it. It's gotten really positive rave reviews in the press. Tell us a little bit about the book and why you wrote it and what it's about.
Sure. So my book is called Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back. And the book follows the arc of a woman's life. So chapter by chapter, I go through the teen years, online dating, how we parent our children, our careers. And I look at how social media is affecting every single aspect of it and then what we can do about it. And so every single chapter ends with a section called What We Can Do About It. And it talks about how we can change our behavior as users and also what we need to demand from lawmakers and tech companies in order to solve some of the problems that I talk about.
Mm,
And, when I started this book, there's this saying that people write the books that they need to read. And I
mm,
was very much worried about how I would handle my own children's use of social media. But having finished the book, that's no longer my biggest fear. My biggest fear is that my daughters will now have to live in the world that social networks have wrought. And one of the big revelations I had when researching this book is that I think that what's happening online is making the offline world more dangerous for women and girls in so many ways. We look at all of the extremism that's being fostered on not just dark corners of the internet, but also mainstream platforms like TikTok that host and even promote misogynistic content to young men. And it's no surprise that that is normalizing these kinds of views and behaviors and very much affecting the way that women and girls are treated offline. So it's scary.
mhm, mhm,
Let me pull in a second here. I think I agree with, well, I certainly agree it's scary and there are lots of issues, but there's constantly the back and forth around pornography
Hmm.
that says it destroys social relations, and others say, well, the evidence isn't there uh, that it really has that big an effect. And I'm dealing with the question of how big an effect things will have because most of my work lately has been in artificial intelligence. And again, there's the big question: how do we prove something like that one way or other? What's the solid evidence? So let me
Sure.
take you to that solid evidence of where the harms are, as opposed to the things we were talking about just before air, which are some anecdotes
Sure.
about that.
Well, that's an easy one. So, research shows that the vast majority of pornography depicts violence against women. And there's also a huge literature that documents a correlation between witnessing acts of violence in the media and committing acts of violence. And so,
Right. But there's
people who
also a literature saying the opposite. I haven't looked at it particularly deeply, so I don't really know. Uh, so, how do we find what kind of solid evidence-based can we use to decide between those two opinions?
So I don't think they're opinions. I can tell you as a professor of communication, there is quite a wide body of literature that shows that people who witness acts of violence in the media are more likely to commit real world acts of violence. I wrote a piece about this if you want to read more about it and dig into it for CNN Opinion years ago now when Donald Trump, who was in office at the time, tweeted a doctored video that showed him hitting a golf ball, and it depicted Hillary Clinton, his former rival, being knocked down by it. So I wrote a big piece for CNN Opinion at that time. I think the headline was something like, with golf ball retweet, Trump stumbles into the Streisand effect. And I looked at that literature, and I think it's pretty solid. And it also just sort of makes sense that when people are exposed to extremist views, their views and behavior become more extremist. So there's a literature that also looks at how when like-minded people get together, for instance, on social media, the reason their views become more extreme, and Cass Sunstein has written about this, is because they become more confident. And, you know, they're receiving all of this affirmation from other people who share their views. And that's why, for instance, our politics are so polarized. That's why we see so much sort of violent rhetoric on social networks, because, you know, they've created this space for these like-minded, in some cases, psychopaths to commune with one another in communities like, you know, men's rights activists or the Red Pill.
I see one of your
Unfortunately,
chapters,
I don't know
Cara.
anything about, because I try to. I hope, and I hope fewer people look at that stuff myself.
Yeah, Dave, I wanted Cara to expand a little bit, you know, since we're on this topic. I see one of your chapters is sex crimes and murder in the time of social media. Tell us about that. It sounds like that's kind of where what you're talking about here in terms of the impact of media on behavior. Go ahead.
Yes. So I look in that chapter at how social networks have enabled new types of crimes against women and girls. A really obvious one is dating apps. I think dating apps are far more dangerous than people realize, because they're sometimes matching women with registered sex offenders. Unfortunately, the United States does not keep statistics on how many violent crimes are tied to dating apps or other apps that match people for in-person encounters. Back in 2019, Columbia Journalism Investigations worked with ProPublica, and they ran a survey. They said it was non-scientific, but they asked women who'd used dating sites over the previous 15 years about their experiences. And believe it or not, 31% of them said that they had been sexually assaulted by someone they met on one of these sites. And if that statistic is anywhere close to accurate, I don't want my daughters when they grow up anywhere near these sites. So that's one thing. Another thing is sextortion. So that's often when someone meets someone online. The other person, of course, is lying about their identity. They establish an emotional relationship, or what at least feels like an emotional relationship, for the victim. And then they hit the victim up for money. I just did a podcast interview with Dr. Robin Stern for The Gaslight Effect. She told me she fell victim to a catfisher. For my book, I interviewed a woman I used to work with who's one of the most senior women in the world of public diplomacy. She fell victim to a catfisher. So this is happening to really smart, savvy women, and it's become a huge global enterprise. So it's often not, you know, some bad actor in his basement. Often the people who are doing the catfishing are being held practically as slaves themselves. There's been reporting on how men are lured to places like Cambodia with promises of really high-paying jobs. And then when they get there, they're basically held in captivity and forced to catfish people in other countries.
Hmm.
And so it's really scary.
We've got some good news there. somebody is doing something about it. About 600 people who have been, well, possibly kidnapped, possibly simply persuaded with promises to Myanmar, the old Burma, have been released.
That's
And
amazing.
they've been released with help from some of the rebels in the country who, for this purpose, are supported by the Chinese government.
Hmm.
So it's really hard to know where the allies are in something like this. But that was
Absolutely.
just such an odd thing to see. But it seems ridiculous to believe that people are being kidnapped to South Asia to be doing all this. But
There's a
the
huge
numbers in the
ProPublica
Chinese
report
press,
about it.
Yeah,
yeah,
Cara, break down that term catfishing for us. That's a new term to me.
Yeah, catfishing is basically what I described, where someone lies about their identity and establishes an emotional relationship often with someone online. And then once they think that so once the victim thinks she's in a romantic relationship with this person she's corresponding with online, who's probably lying about their identity, then the perpetrator will say something like, I want to come visit you, but my wallet's been stolen. Can you Venmo me the money for the flight and I'll pay you back when I get there, or my bank account is in the US. Dr. Stern, who I uh, spoke with last week on her podcast, told me that her catfisher was supposed to come see her, then said he had to go on a business trip, and then said he forgot his wallet. Could she go to a very high-end camera store and mail him a camera he needed for the trip? And of course, he'd pay her back. There's also been reporting, the New York Times had a fascinating study recently about how catfishers were convincing young, very savvy women to supposedly invest money with them. So they again pretend to establish a romantic relationship and then say, I want to help you make money. And these women are logging into sites that they think are real, and they think that they're watching their crypto purchases grow and that they're making all this money, and they're looking at spreadsheets of their, growing assets online, but really the criminals have disappeared with their money long ago.
Hmm.
So, they keep evolving the schemes. Last year in Riverside, California, a young girl was catfished. And the man actually showed up at her home and murdered members of her family and left with her.
Hmm.
She ended up being found by the police physically safe, but, lost family members in the process. And so, it's scary. It's not just women's emotions and money on the line here, it can be your life.
Well, are women more vulnerable than men? It sounds like they are. I don't want to be sexist in presuming why that is, but why is that?
I think some of it is the stereotype that women are emotionally vulnerable. We know all the stereotypes of women as needy and desperate to be in relationships. Those stereotypes actually aren't true. So, according to research by Pew, actually fewer single women want to be in relationships or dating right now than single men. But that's the idea, right? So, women are seen as vulnerable. So, I'm sure that people of all genders are vulnerable to these kinds of crimes, but I do think that women tend to be particularly targeted. And a number of the women who I interviewed for my book told me that they had actually stopped using dating apps altogether, sometimes because they just didn't think the people they were matching with were often real. So this is a huge problem across these dating apps right now.
Hmm. Mhm.
and it's true, I think, that there's an awful lot of people on dating apps who are not real. And I think we all know that pictures on dating apps and descriptions and ages are usually false, I think. Am I wrong?
I couldn't say if it's usually the case. I heard this story repeatedly from the women who I interviewed that they felt that a lot of the profiles they were seeing just weren't real people. And I talk in my book about how that's only one of the problems with dating apps. So I have this book that looks at this chapter that looks at online dating. It's called Plenty of Catfish. And obviously, part of the problem is that these profiles aren't real, but that's not the only one. I think, dating apps will often claim that if you answer all of these very personal questions about yourself, they will use your answers to match you with the right person. And obviously, one, it's really problematic because we now know that they're often selling your answers and, very intimate information about you to third-party brokers that are very shadowy. The US government has recently said that foreign governments even buy this data. So that's one scary piece of this. But then the other part of it is just that it flies in the face of the research. And so decades of research tell us that you can't predict whether two people will be compatible in a relationship in advance based on their qualities, based on their characteristics. That just sort of doesn't work. And so the advice that I give women or people of all genders who are trying to use these apps to actually find a relationship is that you have to be prepared to do the work of filtering yourself, to look at a lot of profiles. Obviously, you've got to be concerned about whether they're real, but also if you're looking for a serious relationship, and plenty of people on these apps are real but aren't looking for that, you have to be willing to say it and just say, this is what I'm looking for, and own it. And if that's not what you're looking for, please don't contact me. And a big message I have to women and people of all genders, reading this book is just don't take things personally if you feel like someone ends up not wanting to meet you or whatever, it doesn't work out. As we know, a lot of these people aren't real. A lot of these people are looking for victims. A lot of people just aren't looking for relationships on apps anymore. So all sorts of evidence tells us that when people perceive that they have lots of options, they view their romantic partners less valuably, like they just sort of value them less. And so there's all sorts of reasons to say, I'm not going to take this personally, or to take it as a referendum on the other person rather than yourself when things don't work out on these dating apps. Because, the women I talked to for my book said that it took a huge emotional toll to be meeting people who weren't real, or to be meeting people on these apps and having long extended conversations and then have the person never want to meet up offline. And it took a massive toll on their well-being. And so I think it's important for us all to recognize that what the situation really is on apps, and to educate people about why they shouldn't take things personally.
Let's go a little further on that one. You said before you were hoping your daughters wouldn't use dating apps because of all the problems you found. And there's certainly lots of problems that are there and we're talking about. But on the other hand, the way you're talking about how people should be educated to use them well corresponds to what I think is the typical situation, that almost everybody who's not popular or not satisfied with who they're meeting want to reach out and are using the dating apps. And I think the number was real, that a large percentage of American marriages actually started on dating apps. Is it realistic to say people shouldn't use them, or are they just going to do it anyway?
So what I'd
I'm
like
not
to
asking about your daughters. This is a general question.
Yeah, what I'd like to see happen is I'd like to see dating apps change so that they're safer and so that they verify people's identities and people are real and not catfishers and not registered sex offenders. So I think dating apps have a lot of work to do to fix their platforms. The big benefit, as you say, of using a dating app is that it widens the pool, right? I interviewed one expert at Stanford who said, before dating apps came along, your choices were the people mom introduced you to or the people you met through church or at the corner bar. And this widening of the pool is a great benefit benefit. And it's particularly important for people who are, minorities in their physical communities. So for instance, people in the LGBTQIA plus community far more likely to have met their partners online, which makes sense. But at the same time, I think these apps need to be made safer. In terms of whether they're leading to more marriages, I definitely agree with you that my sense is that of the people who get married these days, many, many of them are meeting on dating apps, but overall, a record number of Americans are single. So in the years 2020 and 2021, the marriage rate in the United States hit the lowest numbers since the federal government began tracking it in 1867. And that is a trend that started well before the pandemic. So one of my big theories that I write about in my book, and I wrote about it in a piece that was published by CNN Opinion for Valentine's Day, is that dating apps actually cause people to stay single. There was a study done a few years ago that found that only 12% of Americans had ever been in a committed, or a serious relationship with someone they met on a dating app. And I think that gets back to what I was talking about earlier, which is that when people perceive to have lots of choices, they often don't choose any of them. And when people think they have lots of options for romantic partners, they value the ones they're with far less. And so apps give this impression that there's always someone new to swipe on. And I think that that can help explain why so many Americans are single. So of the Americans who are getting married, yes, I think many of them are meeting on dating apps, but I think the bigger thing to know is that far fewer Americans are getting married these days. Single Americans are also less likely to be living with a romantic partner than they were a couple decades ago before these apps came on the scene.
Interesting. Yeah,
Stu?
go ahead, Dave.
And I was sort of headed to you because it
Okay.
was startling, and I couldn't figure out a good follow-up to that.
Well,
There's
well,
obviously lots of other reasons to explain all this, including mores that have changed, that people, especially in Hollywood, are very comfortable having children with people they haven't married with. For example, Elon Musk, who very openly is having children with several women. I think he's married to one of them. And that's totally acceptable now, or so he thinks. And it's hard to know which of the different changes in our lifetime. I mean, I'm so old. I remember when there was a big scandal when a girl, I think it's appropriate to say a girl because we were all young then, at Barnard, was living with her boyfriend, who was at Columbia, and I happened to know them. And that was a huge scandal that led to very minor disciplinary action at the school because of it. So things have obviously changed a whole lot. And I think I think most people today accept that couples live together. So it's really hard to know what's explaining trends like that. But I have no answers at all.
Well, this actually is a great segue to the next thing we can talk about, because I don't think that Elon Musk is a great role model for anyone. Not just when it comes to having loads of children with lots of different women, but just more broadly looking at what he's done to his platform. So one of the chapters in my book is called The Flounce. Have you guys heard this term before?
No, I have
No.
not.
Okay, so basically what I talk about is how, Elon Musk describes himself as a, quote, free speech absolutist. And he has been much more permissive since he took over X about allowing all sorts of extremist content on his platform. But what the research shows is that when platforms allow this kind of hate and extremist content, women often flee them and leave these platforms altogether. The lingo for this is now called the flounce. It goes back to this Victorian term, and it's this idea of this woman gathering up her petticoats and dramatically storming out of the room. And I say, isn't that kind of a very, very telling phrase, because it suggests that women who are fleeing things like rape threats on social media are somehow overly dramatic and overwrought and emotional, which is incredibly offensive. And so, I think it's important to look at the data, which tells us that on mainstream apps, like for instance, Instagram, more women actually use them. But then on apps that have a reputation for allowing hate and misogyny, it's far more men on these platforms because women flee them when they're targeted. And I talk about tons of women in the public eye, out of the public eye, who have fled social networks when they've been targeted. And it's just incredibly disturbing. And so I think that when we have these conversations about what kind of speech should be allowed, we should also be thinking about the women who are silenced by these policies. One of the big questions that people ask me, I wrote an op-ed for the LA Times that will be published over the next few days. And the editor said to me, I want you to answer this question. You say in your book that these apps are so toxic for women. If that's the case, should women use them at all, and why? And the big argument that I make in my book is, yes, social networks are really toxic for women, but it's unacceptable to tell us not to use them, because these apps are also places where, as we all know, we can find jobs, we can promote our work, we can get involved in important causes. These are places where teenagers develop interests that turn into careers. And so my big message with this book is that we have to fix what's wrong with social media. And what I do is I call on all of us to radically rethink the way that we use social networks ourselves, to use them to share information about issues that affect our lives, to change what we do when we witness sexism and misogyny online. So a big thing I talk about is that it can be very tempting to clap back when you witness hateful content online, right? And to reply to that post and tell the person why they're wrong. And I say in my book that's actually a really bad idea, because that, of course, boosts engagement. And the more engagement that a post gets, the more social networks think we like it and want to see it and will show it to other people. And so I say that when we see this hateful content, we should do two things. One, if we know the person offline, we should talk to them about why we're troubled by their content and why it's wrong, to socially stigmatize the practice. But then two, we should report it to social networks. And social networks are notorious for not responding to reports they get of posts that violate their community standards, or of responding to people who file these reports and saying, no, that rape threat didn't violate our community standards. But what I say is that if more of us filed them, I think it would send a very powerful signal to social apps that we just don't want to see this content on their platforms.
That
Hang on, guys. We got to take a break right here. We're at the halfway
point. The break.
Yeah.
Before we go to the break, we should give the information about the book again. Kara, could you give us the information?
So the book is called Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back. And it has just been published, so it's available now.
Okay. This is Community and Technology. We're speaking with Kara Alaimo, author of the book that she just mentioned. We're talking about social media and women, and fascinating conversation. We're going to talk some more. I want to hear some more about some of the solutions that you just talked about, Kara, and how we can, counter some of this toxicity that's out there for women and others on social media. This is Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3 FM. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after a brief musical break.
As virtuoso, Esperanza Spalding.
Well, Europe gave us classical music, and jazz is America's classical music. Where blues was born in the farms and fields of the South, jazz is urban cool. So I'm gonna sing a song for you that has been sung for more than 6 decades, and it has a message for hope. Originally, this was sung during the Great Depression when the end was not in sight. So I hope you enjoy, and I hope you try living on the sunny side of the street. I used to walk in the shade with my blues on parade, but I'm not afraid. It's over, passing right over. Grab your head and grab your coat. Leave your worries on the doorstep. Just direct your feet to the sunny side of the street. Can't you hear the pitter-pat and that happy tune in your step? Life could be so sweet on the sunny side of the street. I used to walk, I admit, in the shade with my blues on parade, but I'm not afraid. It's over, passing right over. If I never had 1 cent, I'd be rich as Rockefeller. Stardust at my feet, on the sunny side of the street. Oh, baby. I used to walk in the shade with my blues on parade, but now I'm not afraid. It's over, this rover's passing over. If I never had 1 cent, I'd be rich. Probably he's not the richest one anymore, but at least I've had some gold dust at my feet on the sunny, on the shady, on the sunny side of the street.
Okay, we're back. Community Technology with Stewie and Dave Burstein, our special guest, Cara Alimo, who's a professor at Fairleigh Dickinson on social media. Before the break, Cara, we were talking a little bit about, what folks can do, and women in particular, to kind of take control of social media so there's more, they're more empowered by it as opposed to impacted negatively by the toxicity that you've been talking about. Tell us a little bit more about some of the proactive things that we and women can do.
So first of all, I think it's important for all of us to make more of a conscious effort to follow and amplify the posts of women. A number of studies have shown that When women use social networks to try to bolster their careers, they often end up with fewer followers, fewer reposts, and fewer resulting opportunities. So things like speaking engagements than the men in their fields. And so I think we have to be aware of this bias that our society appears to have in turning to men more than women for their expertise. On my website, which is karaalaimo.com, I have posted a list of suggested feminists to follow. And of course, they're just the tip of the iceberg. But the point is that we need to make a conscious effort to follow other women. I think we all need to radically rethink how we use social media and use it to share information, as I've said, about issues that affect our lives. And then repost and amplify the posts of other people, especially women who are doing the same. I think if employers were aware of this disparity, they could make more of an effort to amplify the posts of their women staffers at all levels. So I'd love to see Fortune 500 companies retweeting and reposting the posts of their women staffers with permission, of course, on their official corporate channels. I would love to see tech companies do a better job of suggesting we follow more women and amplifying the voices of women more. As I've said, when we see people posting abusive content, if we know them well offline, I think it's important to have conversations with them about why it's wrong to try to change social norms. I'd love to chat with you about how to handle our kids' use of social media, which is sort of a whole nother beast. A lot to talk about there. And then in my book, I lay out all sorts of things that tech companies could do. So things like, for instance, telling us when photos have been filtered or manipulated so that women know that the images of people's bodies they're seeing so often aren't real. I think that would be hugely beneficial to people's mental health. And I lay out what lawmakers should do. And there's a few things that are very top of mind for me right now. One is passing the Defiance Act of 2024, which would allow people to sue people who create new deepfakes and share it without their consent. I'd like to see
Is that
Congress.
federal? Is that a federal
It would be,
legislation
and
that's been proposed?
it would be, and it's a bipartisan bill that's
Mhm.
incredibly important. I'd like to see legislation not only requiring that images and video generated by AI are watermarked, but criminalizing the removal of those watermarks, because we know that it's incredibly easy to remove these watermarks. And, in particular, I'm very worried these days about deepfakes, new deepfakes of women that are circulating online because it's life destroying for women. So I think, Congress has a lot of work to do as well.
Mhm. Dave, what do you think
Now,
of that?
let me come in here. Stu and I are active in the Internet Society. We definitely despise hate speech, and Stu is definitely against it. I'm conflicted because I used to be a First Amendment absolutist for real, to the point that a friend of mine was defending the right of Nazis to march and speak. She was at the ACLU when they actually went to defend them in court. How the Internet Society basically believes that any government interference, like the laws you're suggesting, is a mistake and interferes with the open internet. How would you respond to that if you were talking to them?
I think I'd say exactly what we were just talking about, which is that it's not true that hate speech promotes free speech. What hate speech does is it silences the voices of victims, and that's why it's unacceptable.
Well, it's not a question of whether it's acceptable or unacceptable. It's a question of whether the government getting involved is going to have a positive effect, or the negative effects, sometimes unanticipated, sometimes just establishing a precedent. In particular, establishing a precedent for suing Facebook because of something that somebody said there is a very big issue.
Well, what I've suggested is that people be able to sue the perpetrators. And so, first of all, there's all sorts of precedents, many, many precedents for the government to restrict free speech in all sorts of cases, from defamation to violent threats. But sort of going beyond that, if we look at the case of deepfakes, so experts say that the majority of deepfake images are pornographic. And we know that when nude images of a woman are posted online, it puts her at greater risk of sexual assault. It puts her at greater risk of depression and suicide. It makes it harder for her to date. It makes it harder for her to get a job. It is life destroying. And so I very much think that when these images are shared without a woman's consent, she should be able to sue the perpetrator. And I think most reasonable people could agree that people don't have the right to create, fake nude images of women and potentially, drive them to suicide, for fun.
Yeah, sure. We think this is a bad thing, but going after the perpetrator doesn't work very well because it's also incredibly easy to hide your identity on this stuff. It's been impractical for the record companies to get anywhere suing people who put up, or the movie companies, which is actually the ones who are going to court, suing people who put up pirated videos because they're hiding behind anonymity, so they feel they have to sue the carrier. And in fact, there was $1 billion judgment against Cox, a big cable company, on this, which I think has been sent back by the appeals court. But that's a big question. If you can't saying, oh yeah, we're going to go against these people who illegally speak or illegally create pornography, doesn't work.
So copyrighted material is actually a really great example because there's this exemption to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, under which tech companies can be held liable for posting copyrighted material. And because of that, what we see is that they're very, very quick to take it down. And so if it were the case that tech companies were held liable for things like intimate images that are posted online without people's consent, I think it's obvious that they would be quick to take it down. And I think that that's another reasonable exemption to Section 230. I can't see why the interests of Warner Brothers are more important than the interests of this country's women.
Again, it's not clear any of that is going to work very well. It's trivial to set up a VPN, and almost nobody, short of the security agencies, has been able to break VPNs. I mean, yeah, the CIA definitely intercepts many of them. But is that going to work? And then there's always the question. We have no question thinking about, well, Taylor Swift's many, many deep fakes naked that were posted on Twitter, so many that Twitter literally couldn't keep up with it. And that's definitely the kind of thing that can happen.
Right. I'm in heated agreement that it's hard to track down perpetrators. But in this case, if tech companies were required for taking the content down, of course, they'd have a big incentive to do so. Right now, they lack that incentive.
If it's clearly illegal, they probably have the incentive. But we're now having a case an example that's getting major attention in Germany, where ministers just said that Twitter must take down hate speech and that they are breaking the law by not doing so rapidly. And that saying they're breaking the law is, of course, a threat to prosecute them. And we've got the $2 billion fine that the EU just gave Apple, although that was on antitrust issues, not hate speech. But is that appropriate? And how do we define, if we define this as very limited to to absolutely clear cases, people who want to do the breakdown, who want to do the interference, will be totally unhappy. Just as people, and there are many of them, some of them with billion-dollar budget, with billions of dollars to spend on this advocacy, who think that saying that what Israelis are doing in Gaza is a god-awful mistake at best, and claim that's anti-Semitism and hence should be illegal. And most of the actual cases that come up are not clear on speech. If I say, I wish I could kill Donald Trump, or I wish I could kill Joe Biden, is that a threat? In my case, it wouldn't be, but there's certainly people in the Secret Service who would who might take it very seriously. How do we always have that edge in defining things. And when we're talking about major legal judgments, which is what you're saying should scare the carriers, you have a very hard time doing a good definition.
Yeah, I agree with you. Even Supreme Court justices find it probably to be one of the hardest parts of their job to figure out where to draw the line in terms of free speech. But what I call for in my book, of course, is making it illegal to share nude images of a woman without her consent, whether they're authentic or whether they're generated by artificial intelligence. And I think that reasonable people can agree that it should be illegal to do so, and that tech companies should take these life-destroying images down when this happens to women. So I don't see big room for debate on that one. I think it's a really clear-cut one.
Hey, Dave, isn't there something pending before the Supreme Court around Section 230 and the carrier's liability for content? Isn't that something that they're going to be looking at?
Big issue. Ironically, from the right, who think that the social media platforms are prejudiced against them. I suspect our guest has seen the research that says actually it's the opposite when you look at who is most popular and most promoted on social media. It's often the conservative voices. So these are really big questions, because it's hard, and most of the people who care have very strong opinions that go far beyond the absolutely clear cases. Not Kara, who's saying it's clear here, but the typical advocate. And as I say, we have the example of the most prominent Republicans up to Donald Trump making a false claim that social media is excluding conservative voices, which just doesn't happen to be true.
Right. So the cases before the Supreme Court hinge on whether social networks have a right to moderate their platforms and to take down content that they deem to be harmful or to violate their community standards. And, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act actually does explicitly state that platforms have the right to do this. So I think the law is actually quite clear on this.
Actually, the law is not clear internationally. We just have the issue of India, where, again, a minister, this is state action, has just threatened Google for cutting off apps. The battle on that was not on hate speech. It was about Google taking its 30% ripoff off the top of every app in Europe. And the argument by many people in the US is that, well, that's what capitalism is about. And if there's a problem, it's going to be solved by competition. And the answer in India is 95% of the phones in India are Android. So that if Google takes an action against somebody, that would actually put major applications out of business. And that's true around the world in terms of how much market power. Google and Facebook and Twitter have enormous market power, and hence have enormous power. So people say they should, many people say you don't want to set the precedent of telling them what they have to do without a court order. And other people think that, well, they have so much power, they should be treated like monopolies are and heavily regulated. A lot of people, Stu and I know, think that regulation is absolutely a mistake, including the Section 230 examples that you just gave me. So these are really complicated questions, and I don't pretend to have answers.
Okay, maybe we can, we don't have the answers, Dave. I suggest we talk about some other stuff that Cara has written about. The Section 230 issue is something that Dave and I have talked about many times on our show, Cara, and there's no easy answer. So that's something that we're going to follow up on and follow through on, over the coming weeks and months. But there's some other things that you talk about in your book, Cara, that I wanted to get to. We only got about maybe 7 minutes left in the show. You talk about careers, women and careers, and how social media is affecting that, and then also kids and social media. So can you touch on some of those issues for us?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, the big thing I'm concerned about with careers is just that when women experts share their expertise on social networks, they don't often end up with as many followers and reposts and resulting opportunities as the men in their fields. And so I think that's where we all have to be aware of this and actively work to follow more women and to amplify the voices of women more. And then I take on, so in the first chapter of my book, which is called Girl Meets Instagram, I take on teens and social media. And what I say is that social networks can be deadly for kids and social networks can be lifelines for kids. So much of it comes down to how our kids use them. And so one of the stories I tell in my book is of a woman named Vivian who says that she got her eating disorder on Instagram as a teenager. And she talks about how she shared a picture of herself doing a handstand because she loved to do yoga and ended up falling down this rabbit hole of toxic fitspiration, so fitness inspiration content. That has profoundly affected her and continued to affect her as a woman in her 20s. But then I also talk about, kids who are minorities in their physical communities, but then they go online and they find their people online, or kids who get involved in important causes online or develop interests that turn into careers. And so I think it so depends on how kids use these apps. One piece of advice I have for parents is to sit down and look at content with your kid on TikTok or on Instagram. And if you do that and you look for content about your kid's interests, what's so great is that even when you're not sitting there with your kid, the algorithm will think that that's what your kid wants or know that that's what your kid wants and show them more of it. And so I think a lot of it is about finding the healthy content and staying away from the toxic content. Another big message I have to parents is to make sure that your kids know that no matter what happens online, they can come to you for help. I interviewed an attorney who prosecutes cases involving cyber sex crimes, and she told me that one of the most dangerous situations you can be in is if your kid is being, say, sextorted, but they're afraid that if they tell you, you'll take their phone away. And so your kids need to know that you'll be there and perhaps that you won't take their phone away, come what may, but that you'll be there to help them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Lastly, Cara, if you could tell us a little bit about, your work at Fairleigh Dickinson. I think you mentioned that you were brought in specifically to create social media curriculum. Tell us about that experience and what it's been like.
That's right. So I joined Fairleigh Dickinson University last year to create our new academic programs in social media. So now if you major in communication at Fairleigh Dickinson, you can get a concentration in social media. Or alternately, you can major in something else, say business, and do a minor in social media. A lot of my students find this to be a very exciting offering because they love the idea of graduating and going to work as, say, social media managers for corporations or for individuals. And this gives them the expertise they need to manage the social accounts of organizations. But there's another super interesting component of this curriculum, and that is that we also prepare students who want to work for tech companies to manage them responsibly. So we grapple with a lot of the things you talk about on this show, right? How do we create algorithms that don't bake in racism and other forms of bias? How do we craft community standards
You know
that
why I'm
allow?
laughing? You know why I'm laughing, right? What happened to Google in the last 2 weeks?
So things like that, things like
That's an algorithm that failed.
things like how do you, just what we were talking about, how do you create community standards that allow for freedom of expression but disallow hate? And so these are the big questions that we tackle in this program, and I think that latter component is what makes it so unique.
Mhm. Yeah, you're chuckling about something that Carol was mentioning there.
Yeah, in fact, Google came up with an algorithm to eliminate or to reduce the fact that almost all the people were in responses. Google, were white, usually men, and wound up answering the query to make a picture of Nazi soldiers with a black man who was highly unlikely to have been a Nazi soldier because the algorithm just was wrong, and similarly put a black man in founding fathers and women as professional football players. So it's real, and Google is a very competent outfit, and they totally blew coming up with this algorithm.
Mm-hmm.
That was why I was chuckling when you said create an algorithm, because Google is being excoriated across the internet for getting this one wrong.
Okay, we're about done with time. We're talking with Cara Alimo, author of Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back. Any final thoughts, Cara, that you'd like to leave with our audience?
Just that, social media can be very toxic places for women, but let's all remember that if we rethink what we share, who we follow, and what we do when we witness things like sexism and misogyny online, we can empower ourselves and other women on these platforms.
Thank you so much. That was Cara Alimo. This is Community Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reed every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure and follow us. You just might learn something. Thanks so much. Good night, all.